Thank you very much for having me. I had a little bit of trouble getting here this morning. I busted a flat on the 91. Yeah, these things are always well timed, as we know, And so I had a little bit of a time to sort of sit and gather my thoughts while I called AAA, but the Metro fellow got there first. It's really nice to have people sort of competing to help you out when you're in a bind, right? And actually, that's the mark of a healthy and a flourishing community, really. It's one thing to do something for your neighbor out of obligation. It's one thing to help somebody because you're getting paid for it, or maybe the rules or the laws sort of compel you to act in a certain way. And we need incentives, we need laws, right? We need structure in society. But ultimately, the thing that holds communities together is something deeper and more profound and more spiritual than that, whether you're religious or not. And that, in a word, is goodwill. Goodwill. Unity, I think, is an important value. I want to see a great deal more unity in America, in our communities, between our parties. But unity can never rest on perfect agreement about how we do things, about what our policies should be, about our interpretation of religious doctrine or American history or the Constitution. The foundation for unity is something that requires little to no agreement on political policy matters at all. It's the idea that we actually mean well for one another. This idea of goodwill as being at the heart of human flourishing and social progress is the foundation of Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of nonviolence. Dr. King believed that love, agape love, which means in essence goodwill, was a spiritual force that could affect social change. And he demonstrated that in a movement that galvanized the better angels of our natures across racial, political, and religious lines in his own time. That's a long preamble for talking a little bit about the moment that we're in American life. Mayor Croft, I thank you very much for the introduction and for a few of the points on my bio. As you mentioned, I come from a politically diverse family background. I'll just say a little bit by way of reflection on sort of my family background, and I'll sort of give you guys a little bit of that by sharing a bit of an anecdote from my campaign experience. I have, in different ways, been around politics for many years, but I've only ever run for office once. My record stands at 0-1, which is okay. I tell people oftentimes, my mental health probably was all the better for not being a member of Congress, at this moment. But I did run way back in 2014. I was the youngest active nominee for Congress in the state of California at the time. And I was running the California 43rd, which picks up big parts of South Los Angeles, the city of Inglewood, but also at the time had been redrawn to bring in parts of South Bay, LA County, Torrance, Lomita. And so, there were Republicans and Democrats in the district, though it leaned fairly Democratic. And but whether I was speaking to a black Democratic-leaning church in South Central Los Angeles or to a white Tea Party club in South Bay, LA County, people tended to have the same question for me back in those days, which was something along the lines of, how on earth at the age of 26 are you qualified to represent a district as diverse and complicated as the California 43rd? And my answer, whether I was speaking to, folks in urban LA on the left or folks in suburban LA on the right, and it was always tended to sort of be the same. I'd tell people, well, I have an interesting sort of family background. My mother is a liberal black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father, on the other hand, is a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my mother to my father to my mother, and that's why I can represent all of you. And so, yeah, it tended to frame things up pretty well. Truth be told, I somebody who grew up very blessed, but with a bit of an identity crisis, as so many young people do, and that's just a part of the human experience. But it was compounded a little bit by the sort of complexity of my cultural, ethnic upbringing. My mother and my father's marriage did not last. They had deep differences in their life experience, their worldviews, and the cultures that they came from, and in many respects, some of the things that sort of arose between them mirror some of the divides that are scaled up in our country. What was always amazing to me, though, being a person who sort of came from these different worlds, was the way in which the complicated realities of the histories that we trail behind us and the relationships we have with each other can sometimes blind us to the good and to the humanity that motivates us in our differences. Right? The American people have different relationships to government on the basis of very different histories, and much of the difference in those relationships explains why we may see the role of government in a different way. But just because I see the role of the Constitution as being focused on protecting individual liberties and the rights of state and local governments, doesn't make me a racist anymore as somebody who believes that it is the role of the government to ensure a right to health care, to ensure equity, and a just distribution of resources and opportunities in American life across the lines of color and class. Doesn't make me a Marxist, doesn't make me a communist or a radical, right? But the funny thing is that the more we lean into these stereotypes of each other, the more we tend to push at least some of our neighbors out to the fringes where the most hostile and cynical interpretations of the motivations of our neighbors and the American people tend to germinate and flourish in a destructive way. And so, as a young person growing up, I had to sort of reconcile myself with the fact that, I oftentimes heard stereotypes and different things flying back and forth from one side to the other. And, if you're somebody, as so many of us are these days, who sort of thinks of Republicans or Democrats as being by definition the enemy, you sort of latch on to these stereotypes as easy explanations for why people are the way they are. But for me, that was always very difficult, because in the final analysis, Democrats and Republicans to me have always really just simply been mom and dad, flawed but good, right? Coming from different places but wanting to get to the same positive end. And two sides of our national family from which I have received love my entire life. Now, my mother graduated from Artesia High School. I think she probably would have been class of 1980 or so. My wife graduated there in 2005. Both deep experiences in the city of Lakewood. And one of my friends who graduated with my wife and who inhabited those same stomping grounds, I never spent a lot of time in Lakewood growing up, but a number of my friends did. And she told me, she said she always felt that as a person of faith and as a person of color, that she could be all of who she was in Lakewood, right? Where she didn't necessarily feel quite that same way in some of our neighboring cities. Braver Angels, as Mayor Croft mentioned, is America's largest grassroots bipartisan organization dedicated to the work of political depolarization. But I tend to like to deepen that explanation by saying that what we are really about is reviving the communal fabric of American democracy. We are a membership organization, about 12,000 or so dues-paying members across the country, about 100 or so local bipartisan alliances, work in the United States Congress, state and local government, activity on probably 65, 70 or so campuses across America. We even have a singer-songwriter community, about 150 strong or so of folks who employ art and music in projects and programs aimed at creating healing between people in our fractious politics. But our heart and soul is located in grassroots communities and kitchen tables across America. Our initial workshop program offering was something called a red-blue workshop, where we would bring together small groups of folks from the right and from the left, reds and blues, as we say in-house, not to argue or debate politics, but to literally speak from the vantage point of their own personal or lived experience in terms of why they see politics the way that they do. It's quite literally the application of marriage counseling to the relationship between Republicans and Democrats, right? Which for a country that feels like she's on the verge of divorce now and again is perhaps not an unwise approach to take. But really, all of this is about getting us to the point to where we in the United States of America fully embrace and embody in the way we run our communities and the way we pursue political discourse and negotiation, and in our professed beliefs, the deep value and imperative of inclusion, right? Now, inclusion is a word that you sort of hear thrown about a fair amount, and sometimes it means something deep, and sometimes it means something superficial. It's one thing to want to check boxes on a list, right? To say, okay, well, we've got this number of people in the room. They're all, sharing a space. We've hit our inclusion quota, right? Our diversity and inclusion quota. Dr. King, however, had sort of a deeper view of this idea. Of course, King was a great proponent of integration, and he differentiated between desegregation on the one hand and integration on the other hand. Dr. King said that while desegregation was important, it was important to roll back the Jim Crow laws and the other policies that kept Americans divided and would not allow them to share space together. Dr. King said that ultimately desegregation was not enough, that it was not enough to have people who were simply, superficially different standing elbow to elbow with each other in a room. People needed to be heart to heart with one another in community. That's a very different thing. You can't have true and sincere inclusion, just as you cannot have deep and meaningful community without giving people the opportunity to truly be heard. To truly be heard from the core of their own values, from the core of their own experiences, in their full and total honesty. Brave Angels provides structures by which individuals, institutions, communities, and even politicians and elected officials can make that possible in difficult situations. But ultimately, this is the goal and the imperative for all of us in any of our walks of life. But to make the space for people to fully show up as who they are brings with it a certain amount of risk, because we will inevitably become uncomfortable in certain situations when we hear a truth that challenges the way we see the world. That's okay. We can grow through discomfort, and we have to. That's the beauty and the promise of the American experiment, isn't it? That out of many we are one, but this melting pot process has never been quite so smooth. And in fact, there are reasons to take some issue with the melting pot metaphor, because we're not even trying to all be the same, right? More of a tossed salad of democracy, I guess, is what we're going for, But there is something deeper that can unite us, and again, I just come back to it. It is agape love. It is goodwill. It is the golden rule, this ethos that we should love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And add to that we should love our enemies, right? That we should want even those with whom we have the most virulent political disagreements to ultimately live flourishing lives. Because true flourishing comes from the heart. It comes from within. Dr. King said, again, that we seek not to defeat or humiliate our opponents, but to win his understanding and his friendship so that we may be reconciled to one another in the beloved community. Lakewood, you should be extraordinarily proud of what you have built in this city, what you as a community have built and developed in the generations of Lakewood before you, and what you have left as a legacy and what you will leave as a legacy for the generations to come. This is a community of people who authentically care about each other, who are making space for deep and substantive differences in a way that allows you to not merely tolerate one another's existence, but to embrace one another as a part of a larger shared municipal family. That is an extraordinary and a beautiful thing, a beautiful example to set for a larger nation that is having a difficult time embodying those same practices and principles. And yet the city of Lakewood proves that it is possible. Not only that it is possible, but that as a matter of fact, it is the American way. And so at Braver Angels, we simply seek to take that ethos that is so remarkably, I think, expressed in this gathering here and in the spirit and character of your community, and make it just a little bit easier for other folks to do likewise. And my hope is that in the months and years to come, we can all of us work together to make of this a country that truly lives up to the ideals of the beloved community, the idea that we are all of us created equal, and the promise of the American experiment, which says, once again, e pluribus unum, that out of many we are one, not because we are the same, but because even though we are different, we come together in a spirit of goodwill. And perhaps another way to have said this, when we look back on this and write the history of the era at which America followed the example of Lakewood and came together again, might simply be to quote Mayor Croft and say, we could have zigged, but we zagged. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so happy to be with you.